Good evening, I'm Anderson Cooper at the CNN Center in Atlanta. Thanks for joining us. In the next half hour, Walter Mondale, will he or won't he replace Senator Paul Wellstone on the November 5th ballot? Minnesota Democratic Party leaders move closer to a decision. Also, relatives visit and hold a memorial at the crash site. And the man arrested as a material witness in the D.C. sniper case, well, he has his first day in court. We're going to bring you up to date right now with a news alert. President Bush and Pacific Rim leaders are putting on a united front at the end of this weekend's APEC summit in Mexico. Despite some lackluster gains, they're urging North Korea to dismantle its nuclear weapons program, but Asian leaders are rejecting President Bush's zero-tolerance policy on Iraq. Bloodshed in the Middle East today. A suicide bomber killed 3 Israeli reservists when he detonated a device outside the Jewish settlement of Ariel. At least 19 other people were wounded. Israeli security forces say they killed 2 Palestinians and wounded a 3rd in Nablus in the West Bank. Disturbing news about the gas used to knock out Chechen rebels and their hostages in that Russian theater standoff the other day. 115 of the 117 hostages killed, well, they died of complications from the gas. Russia has not released the name of it, but medical officials say it is some kind of anesthesia agent. In eastern Oklahoma, complaints about a teen's driving apparently sparked a 20-mile shooting spree. Police say 18-year-old Daniel Fears stole his dad's shotgun and used it to kill 2 people and wound 8 others on Saturday. They say Fears surrendered after he plowed through a roadblock and then crashed his vehicle into a ditch. The tragic plane crash that took Senator Paul Wellstone's life put Democratic leaders in Minnesota in a tailspin. While dealing with their own grief, they have to focus on the November election and pick someone to try to fill the void. CNN's Judy Woodruff is in St. Paul, Minnesota, says Wellstone's family is asking a familiar face to step forward. Judy?
That's right, Anderson. And before we get to politics, I just want to say that the flowers and the signs and the steady stream of people coming here to Wellstone headquarters in St. Paul say it all. The man who died in that plane crash on Friday was not just another elected official.
2 days after Paul Wellstone perished in a plane crash, Minnesotans were still coming to his campaign headquarters in St. Paul to pay their respects. So was Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle.
Paul Wellstone, in many ways, was the soul of our Democratic Party. He brought us back to our roots and the things that we deeply believe in.
But with the election just 9 days away, Daschle and other Democrats, and most important, Wellstone's sons, have already settled on former Vice President Walter Mondale as their first choice for a replacement. The elder son, David, met with Mondale yesterday to tell him so. Mondale helped found the state's unique Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which will convene almost 900 delegates Wednesday night to vote their preference.
Mr. Mondale certainly is a very broad, sentimental choice of Democrats across the state of Minnesota, but I do remind people that we have a democratic process at the DFL party. It's a long tradition. We will hold this convention.
For his part, Mondale won't say anything publicly until after a Wellstone memorial Tuesday night. Where all this leaves the Republican candidate, Norm Coleman, is in a delicate spot. And that was clear today as he tried simultaneously to signal that he's ready to do battle with Mondale if he is the candidate, while showing respect for Wellstone's memory.
I think some of us, and certainly for the people of Minnesota, we still need a little time. We need some time to grieve and to mourn and to reflect on those who lost their lives. And there will be a vigorous campaign, but I think it's going to be on hold for still a little bit.
Still, that reference to a short but vigorous campaign was enough to elicit an early warning from Tom Daschle.
Well, I was very disappointed with the very negative tone that Mr. Coleman took in this race, far more negative than it had to be. That wasn't Paul Wellstone's style. I'm sure if that's his characterization of the coming days, I just hope that while it's vigorous, he can refrain from being as negative as he has been.
Coleman advisors, for their part, insist that it was not a bitter, mean campaign before Paul Wellstone died. But we hear a different story from the people who worked for Paul Wellstone. They do feel some bitterness, and what we're going to be watching for, Anderson, is whether some of that bitterness spills over into the short campaign that develops between the memorial service on Tuesday night and the election less than 1 week later. Anderson?
Judy, bitter or not, it was a close campaign. All polls seem to indicate a pretty close race. Is there any sense of where things now stand? I mean, everything's sort of up in the air, isn't it?
It is completely up in the air. You're right, the polls were close, and actually Wellstone in some polls had pulled a little ahead in the days, week or so before his death. But right now, as you can imagine, no polls are being done. They presumably will pick up in the next few days once it's clear that Mondale has accepted this invitation and a request on the part of the party and the Wellstone family. But until then, everything's in a state of suspended animation. All
right, Judy Woodruff, thanks very much. At the scene of that horrible plane crash in Minnesota, NTSB investigators are now going through the debris by hand. Relatives of the victims were taken to the woody, swampy crash site in Eveleth earlier today. That is where CNN's Susan Candiani joins us with the latest on the investigation. Susan?
Hello, Anderson, and it was a very dignified memorial held for those family members this day. Now, as far as the investigation goes, weather remains one of several factors that investigators are considering, and they continue to insist that they are giving it no more weight than any of the other factors. For the first time this day, journalists were allowed a closer look at the crash site, where investigators have been working from sunup to sundown ever since this happened, collecting evidence. And this is where the real expertise comes in as they try to determine what each small piece of wreckage means, including looking at the burned and damaged wings, for example. And they are finding, to their delight in a way, that they are finding many more parts of the cockpit than they thought before, because it is largely destroyed, but they are recovering some gauges and meters. Also this day, they removed engines from the site, from the crash area very deep in the woods, and the engines were taken to a local airport hangar. They will be partly examined there, but in fact be transported from here, from Minnesota, to Pratt & Whitney, where those engines were manufactured in Canada, and there they will be torn apart. They are also examining the icing equipment located on the tail and the wings of the aircraft to see whether it was working properly. In fact, they expect the work at the site to be going on for several more days.
The investigation has gotten to a very difficult stage for our people. We're at the hand sifting of debris to try and pick out aircraft parts or instrument parts. We're using small brushes to dust pieces off. We're using sifters, and it's a very meticulous, slow-going process.
Also today, beyond the view of the cameras, a private memorial service at the crash site. It was attended by 17 relatives of the 8 people who were killed. Senator Wellstone, his wife and daughter, 3 staffers, including 23-year-old Will McLaughlin, who worked for him, whose photograph was left behind, and the 2 pilots were remembered as well. 17 roses were left by the family members. Also, a chaplain was on hand to give comfort to those who attended this brief service. Finally, we were also told this day some of the last radar information, including that at 10:18 on Friday, the plane was making its final approach and was cleared by the air traffic controllers located in Duluth. 1 minute later, the aircraft started to drift southward, and in fact, it was discovered south of the runway, which they said was off course, and just 2 minutes later, they had the last hit on radar. Anderson, back to you.
All right, Susan Candiani, thanks very much. We go now to the latest on the sniper investigation. A lawyer for Nathaniel Osborne says Osborne is cooperating fully with investigators and is expected to go to Maryland for questioning. Now, Osborne waived his right to a detention hearing in Flint, Michigan today. CNN's David Mattingly has more on his link to the sniper suspects.
Nathaniel Osborne, the registered co-owner of the now infamous Blue Caprice, before a federal magistrate in Flint, Michigan Sunday. While not a suspect in the D.C. area sniper shootings, his arrest deemed necessary so investigators could question him as a material witness in a case where legal turf battles continue to intensify. He's being brought to Montgomery County, Maryland, the first jurisdiction to file first-degree murder charges against John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malveaux.
That doesn't mean we're going first. And that doesn't mean we're the only jurisdiction that will prosecute these people. Each and every jurisdiction will have the opportunity to prosecute these two men and to impose what penalty they would like to do.
Montgomery County Prosecutor Doug Gansler defending his decision to apparently break rank among jurisdictions, setting off a race to the courthouse. Local prosecutors in Virginia say charges will now be filed against the two suspects Monday in Spotsylvania County, the site of both a fatal and non-fatal shooting. And while 6 were killed in Montgomery County, Virginia Attorney General Jerry Kilgore tells CNN, "We have Virginia victims and crimes against the people of Virginia, and we want the 2 individuals prosecuted in Virginia court."
Certainly, the more victims you have in a jurisdiction, the more likelihood are you're going to have the best case. But then you also have the issue of what's going to be the eventual outcome of the case. You know, is that person going to be more likely to be executed or not?
Virginia's Kilgore also telling CNN, "Our death penalty is tried, tested, and ready." Virginia prosecutors could pursue capital murder charges against the 17-year-old suspect Malveaux if he is tried as an adult. This could not happen in Maryland, where the death penalty age is 18.
Adding to the contentious legal scenarios, the death penalty will also be sought in cases already pending against Malveaux and Muhammad in Alabama from a murder that predates the sniper attacks. Officials will continue to look to the Justice Department to act as mediator for jurisdictions as they slowly determine who has the best case and who eventually gets to go first. David Mattingly, CNN, Montgomery County, Maryland.
We go overseas now. Did Russian forces make a terrible, deadly mistake in ending a hostage ordeal? The gas they used to free the hostages killed more than 100 of them. How could it have happened? We will have the latest from Moscow. And what did President Bush achieve at his weekend summit in Mexico? That answer when CNN Sunday continues. Sight to see overnight in Italy. Europe's biggest and most active volcano, Mount Etna, spewed lava. Look at that, amazing, a brilliant display of its might. A series of small earthquakes damaged buildings on the mountain slopes, but there are no reports of injuries. Etna's towers 10,860 feet above Sicily. Its last major eruption was back in 1992. Just amazing pictures. Russian health officials say gas, not gunfire, was responsible for 115 of 117 hostage deaths in that standoff at a Moscow theater. Now, that revelation has angered many in Russia. CNN's Mike Hanna has more on the fallout from Moscow.
Relatives and friends of the rescue hostages had been demanding details of why their friends and relatives were still in hospital and why so many hostages had died in the rescue that happened in the early hours of Saturday morning. Answers came from the Russian authorities, and very serious answers indeed. Russian medical officials have announced that all but 2 of the 117 hostages who've died as a result of complications coming from the inhalation of gas. Now, gas was used by Russian special forces shortly before they stormed the Moscow theater in the early hours of Saturday morning. The reason for this, to subdue instantly the Chechen separatists who had wired themselves to explosives and who had threatened to detonate these explosives should the Russian forces storm the theater. According to medical officials, the narcotic used in this operation was similar to one used in surgery. However, the concentrations used were intense to ensure that the Chechen separatists were unable to detonate those explosives that they placed in the theater and attached to their bodies. Also, say medical officials, the conditions of the hostages over 58 hours in the theater had made them more susceptible to the effects of the gas. They said that the hostages had been sitting in one place for a number of time. Some of them had chronic illnesses in the first place. All of these a combination of factors that led to some hostages being sicker than others and also to some hostages actually dying. And further details provided by the medical authorities. More than 600 of the hostages are still receiving treatment in hospital. About 200 of them are in intensive care wards, and an estimated 40 hostages are described as being in a critical condition. The sense of euphoria that followed the end to this hostage crisis now dissipating, now being replaced by a sense of anger. Monday has been declared a national day of mourning, but amidst the grief, mounting anger, The Chechen separatists who were responsible for the situation in the first place are mostly dead, but the possibility now that the authorities too will be held accountable. Mike Hanna, CNN, Moscow.
White House spokesman Ari Fleischer spoke with reporters just a short time ago about the president's reaction to the news from Russia. Mr. Bush is right now on his way to Phoenix, Arizona for a political rally after leaving the APEC summit in Mexico earlier today. CNN White House correspondent Kelly Wallace is traveling with the president, and she joins us now. Kelly?
Well, Anderson, the White House is not formally commenting just yet on the use of gas by those Russian security forces and holding back any criticism. Ari Fleischer, the president's spokesman, saying the administration doesn't have all the facts and doesn't know all the circumstances. Now, the president has arrived here in Phoenix and will be doing some campaigning. He and his aides, though, voicing some support for what the Russian government has been going through. The White House calling this a tragedy and saying it was a tragedy caused as a result of the terrorists who took hostages, booby-trapped the building, and created dire circumstance. Now, Mr. Bush comes here to Phoenix after that weekend summit where he didn't exactly get everything he was looking for when it comes to Iraq and North Korea. The 21 leaders of the Asia-Pacific Conference meeting in Mexico issuing a statement about North Korea after the country admitted it has an active nuclear weapons program. The statement, though, not as forceful as the administration would have liked. It did not include any condemnation of Pyongyang. Instead, the 21 leaders saying, quote, "We uphold that a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula is important for peace and stability of the peninsula and Northeast Asia. We call upon the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to visibly honor its commitment to give up nuclear weapons." Now, there was also no condemnation yesterday in that statement issued by the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, which also called on North Korea to dismantle its nuclear weapons program. But Ari Fleischer, the president's spokesman, seeing things rather differently, saying the administration believes these are two rather strong statements. He said, quote, "In diplomatic ease, it doesn't get much stronger than what the leaders did here." Now, as for the subject of Iraq, still the president facing a difficult diplomatic challenge. He failed to get any public commitment from Mexico's President Vicente Fox for that tough new UN resolution he is fighting for. That resolution would call for Iraq to face serious consequences if Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein does not disarm. Mexico happens to be a member of the UN Security Council. The president indicating his patience with the UN debate is wearing thin. The message from the president and his top aides is the UN must wrap up this debate very soon. The president saying if the UN does not pass a resolution, then he will lead a coalition of allies to deal with the Iraqi leader. Anderson?
All right, Kelly Wallace, thanks very much. What is the most exciting event in sports? Well, for a lot of fans, it is Game 7 of a World Series, and that is what we got tonight. We'll have a preview from the ballpark coming up next.
This is CNN.
So the NFL has a new career rushing leader. Emmitt Smith of the Dallas Cowboys broke the late Walter Payton's mark of 16,726 yards during today's game against the Seattle Seahawks. Smith broke the record with an 11-yard dash up the field in the fourth quarter right there. He later scored the 150th touchdown of his career. Payton's record had stood since 1987. Despite Smith's big day, Seahawks came out on top 17-14. Game 7 of the World Series gets underway in less than 2 hours, and one team, San Francisco Giants or the Anaheim Angels, is going to go home very happy tonight. The winner gets the title. CNN's Josie Karp joins us from the ballpark in Anaheim with a preview of the excitement. Josie?
Hey, Anderson. Behind me, the San Francisco Giants are going through what we know is their final pregame warm-up of the season. There aren't going to be any more games after tonight, but there are still a lot of unknowns because this series has been very unpredictable. There's one guy who was actually involved in the Game 7 last year who's involved in this one too, and that's the Giants outfielder Reggie Sanders. And he came up with a simple but appropriate word to describe this World Series, and that's weird. We've had 4 one-run games. We've had 2 blowouts. We've seen 2 teams combine for a World Series record 21 home runs, and then we had that dramatic turn of events last night when the Giants were so close to winning the franchise's first World Series since 1954 that they were actually in the Giants clubhouse and they'd set up the podium where the Giants were supposed to get that World Championship trophy. Obviously, that didn't happen. In less than 24 hours, San Francisco has had now to try to find some way to regroup.
Well, one thing about this club, we always come back after tough losses. And we've been doing it over and over and over. And one thing about this club is it seems like it never comes easy, and we never do it easy.
I think when you have two teams that have such a passion to strive for something as as any two teams in a World Series would, and particularly, our club and the Giants are they're good. We're both going after it hard. I think when you have those two teams like that, there's always special things that can happen.
It seems like almost a foregone conclusion that if the Giants do win, that Barry Bonds will be named the World Series MVP. He's batting .500, he has 4 home runs, and that's all when he actually gets to hit the ball, because the Angels have really tried to avoid him and put him on base with all those walks and those intentional walks. And it's almost hard to remember that going into this postseason, Barry Bonds had a reputation as an October underachiever. He has really put that behind him. But what we still don't know, and what we will find out tonight, is whether the game's current best player, and arguably one of the best ever, will be able to, after 17 years as a major leaguer, Anderson, grab the one thing that has eluded him, and that's a championship. Back to you.
Well, we've been talking baseball. I just want to talk football for just a second. Emmitt Smith, new career rushing leader. I understand you talked to him pretty recently. How big was this for him? I mean, how bad did he want this?
Oh, he wanted it very badly. I mean, you could see it when I spoke to him. I went down there a couple of weeks ago, and he's a very team-oriented individual, but he also understands the history, and that was the thing that really seemed to move him, Anderson, when I spoke to him. The history of that rushing record, just how significant it is, and the fact that he was going to break Walter Payton's record, and he's really gotten to know the Payton family, and that's one other reason that made it even more special to him, Anderson.
No doubt. All right, Josie Karp, thanks very much. Have fun in the game tonight. Pinnacle follows a CNN News Alert coming up next.